Now we're moving a little later into the fundamentals unit, talking about the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. Even though there's not a slide on the Articles of Confederation, it is important to understand the problems with it. For example, they didn't have a standing army. There was no way for the government, the national government, to regulate money or trade, right? And there were several other problems as well. You should be able to name some of these, and certainly it's important to understand why they were problems, right? Why is it a problem to not have an army? In this case, because the 13 new states, it's a brand new country. There were several other colonial powers right on their borders. They were worried about potential invasion. And as we learned from Shays' Rebellion, they also couldn't effectively put down internal rebellions. So was the transition from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution planned? Not really, right? They met to actually revise the Articles of Confederation. Turns out that they knew there were problems, right? The problems I just listed. Also, of course, the problem with high collective action barriers, right? With these high transaction costs. So they knew it was a problem, but they actually hadn't planned on just getting rid of it altogether until they were at the meeting and James Madison proposed a new plan, right? And that was the Virginia Plan. You should know what the Virginia Plan contained. You should also know that it was rebutted with the New Jersey Plan, right? And what that plan contained. When I say what those plans contained, I don't mean every single detail, but you should be able to list some similarities and differences between the plans, especially when it comes to the structure of the legislatures and the power of the legislatures, as well as the structure and powers of the executive. So, obviously, those two differing plans required a compromise, right? And that was the Connecticut Compromise, also known as the Great Compromise. And you should know what the Great Compromise said. Spoiler alert, it's what we learn about in our institutions unit. Also, we know there were other conflicts that needed to be resolved with compromise, right? There was that initial log roll compromise on slavery, which compromised between the North wanting strong economic and commercial powers for the national government, but not wanting slavery, and the South wanting the opposite. So they each got their first choice, right? South got slavery, North got economic powers. That led to another conflict. How do we count slaves for purposes of apportionment in the House? Right? So how do we know how many seats each state gets in the House? We count the number of people. Well, are slaves people? And the South argued that yes, they actually are people and should be counted. The North said, well, you're telling us that slaves aren't people and they're your property when you want to keep slavery, but now all of a sudden you're saying they're people and you want to count them? Seemed like a power grab. So there was a compromise there, right? The 3/5 compromise. Every slave would count as 3/5 of a person. Now, we know that the Constitution has the structure it has because of our history of home rule under British control and, of course, our history with British control and British law. It was inspired by the social contract theory set forth in the Declaration of Independence, and it was inspired by the good and bad parts of the Articles of Confederation. The main goal was to help balance the transaction costs and conformity costs that any government has to balance. The balance in the Articles of Confederation was just not right? Too high transaction cost in order to lower conformity costs. So how do we balance these things? How do we reduce transaction costs enough to have an effective government without raising conformity costs? We create checks and balances and a separation of powers among these three branches that can all check and balance each other. This also is solved somewhat by Madison's size principle, where he says conformity costs are really a problem if we have either a tyranny of a minority, like a tyrant, but we're eliminating that with our checks and balances and separation of powers, or a tyranny of the majority, right? And he says that tyranny of the majority, which often results from faction, we can't really ever eliminate. But if we have a big enough country with enough different interests, no faction can ever become large enough to become tyrannical. And that was Federalist 10. So the Federalists argued for the ratification of the Constitution, and they argued that the Constitution was good as it was, without a Bill of Rights, because they felt that a Bill of Rights might actually restrict rights. However, the Anti-Federalists said that this just sounded stupid and that you needed to guarantee rights. It was all fine to say, in theory, guaranteeing rights could paradoxically reduce rights, but at the end of the day, if you don't guarantee some rights, how can we know if we have rights? And with this large federal government under the Constitution that the Federalists argued for, there was a real concern that the government would just be too big to guarantee civil liberties. So the Anti-Federalists argued for a Bill of Rights, which ultimately Madison conceded was necessary, and he proposed the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, actually 12, but we only got 10, during the first Congress. The Bill of Rights, as we've talked about quite recently, grants certain liberties and rights to citizens. So they mainly limit the government, though sometimes they do oblige the government to do things, like provide an attorney. Finally, our last topic of the Foundations unit was federalism. Right? American federalism is this division between two layers of government, the federal or national layer and the state layer, right? Just those two layers. Now, over the years, it has changed from being relatively distinct layers to more marble layers, right? So we go from layer cake federalism to marble cake federalism. All right, and this marble cake federalism was prompted, for the most part, by FDR and his New Deal, right? During the Great Depression, the states needed something to take charge to help out because every issue was too big for one state to deal with, so they allowed the federal government to increase their power. So FDR and Congress, in implementing the New Deal, changed the relationship between the federal government and state governments, thus fundamentally altering federalism.